Welcome to section 1.5. In this section we're going to be discussing how do we show all of our work when we are adding real numbers. Alright, so this could be decimals, could be fractions, could be whole numbers, integers, anything. Okay, how do we add them? And a lot of people say, I just put in my calculator and press enter. Yes, that's wrong, okay? We do not just put it in our calculator. There actually are rules. Alright, so the first objective is let's just talk about how do we add them. Alright, so many of you when you were taught how to work with negative and positive numbers, you probably were taught on a number line. Alright, so let's just kind of review that real quick. This is probably the least effective and least efficient method because we're not going to be dealing with small numbers all the time. Okay, so -2 tells you where you're starting. So here on my number line is -2. So that's where I'm going to start. And then it says I'm going to add to it a -3. And again, think of this as money. You are $2 in debt and you are adding to it more debt. So which direction on the number line are you going to go? Right, you're going to go to the left. You're going to go in debt $1, $2, $3 more. So there would be your final answer, -5. Now, when you have a simple problem like this, the number line would be a totally great way to do this. But what if that problem was -2,745 plus a -3,962? Okay, you're definitely not going to want to draw a number line. So we need some rules on how do we work with these numbers. All right, so here are the rules. When you're adding two numbers together with the same sign, okay, you are going to add together their absolute values. So don't worry about the signs at all. You're just going to add together their absolute values, and you're going to use the sign that they had in common. So if they were both negatives, then the answer would be negative. If they were both positives, then the answer would be positive. So we're just going to talk about how do we use this rule, how do we show it on paper, so that we're sure that we understand how to show our work. All right, so here's our first example. -14 plus -9. Notice they are both negative. I usually address the sign first. They both are negative, so I know my answer has to be negative. And then I'm going to put a set of parentheses. Okay, and I know that if they are the same sign, I'm going to add their absolute values. So I'm going to take the absolute value of -14. I'm going to add to that the absolute value of -9. All right, the absolute value of -14 is 14, and the absolute value of -9 is 9. So some people just like to start with this line right here, and I would be perfectly okay with it because that line tells me that you are following the rule, right? You are following the rule right there. You have kept the common sign and you have added together their absolute values. So that line right there to me is the most important because it tells me that you know the rules. 14 plus 9 is 23. So my final answer is -23. And I know that this might be a very different way than you learned, but again, remember, everything in algebra is about rules and definitions. So we really need to start training our brain to think about rules and definitions all the time. Second example, okay, notice both of these numbers are also negative. So I know that my answer will be negative. And I'm going to add together their absolute values. So I'm going to add together absolute value of -3 plus the absolute value of -5. So that would be negative. Okay, absolute value of -3 is 3 plus the absolute value of -5 is 5. So again, this line right here, if you started right here, I'd be perfectly okay because that tells me that you know the rule. And then my final answer would be -8. Okay, 3 plus 5 is 8. So my final answer is -8. If you are adding together numbers with different signs, things get a little weird. Okay, so we really have to talk about that. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to subtract the smaller absolute value from the larger absolute value. So you're going to do absolute value of the large number minus absolute value of the small number. And then when it comes to your sign, you're going to use the sign whose absolute value is the largest. Okay, so this gets a little more confusing. So we're definitely going to have to practice this a little bit. All right, so we have a -8 plus a 3. And again, I start with the signs. I don't start with just subtracting the absolute values. So I start with the sign. I notice that this 8 has a negative sign and this is a 3. So this has the largest absolute value. So I know the answer is going to be negative. And then I'm going to subtract their absolute values. So notice when they had the same sign, we were adding their absolute values. Now that they have different signs, we are going to subtract their absolute values. And when you subtract the absolute values, really important that the large number goes first. So -8 goes first and 3 goes first. And by large, I don't mean smaller or bigger. I should probably use better language. Okay, by largest, I mean it has the greatest, what we call magnitude. And you'll hear that word again when you get if you ever take a physics class. Okay, so we're talking about just the number disregarding the sign. Okay, -8 is farther from 0 on the number line than +3. So -8 has the larger magnitude. So always start with that larger magnitude number. So absolute value of -8 is 8 minus absolute value of 3 is 3. So again, this line right here tells me that you know what the rule is. So if you don't write that first line, I'm perfectly okay with that. But you definitely need to have this line written where you show the rule. You know what sign you're using, you have the parentheses, you're showing the subtraction of those absolute values. So my final answer is -5. Which, if you think about it, makes sense, because if you owe $8 and you have $3 in your pocket, you're still going to owe me $5. But again, remember, we want to make sure that we're always thinking about these rules when it comes to algebra. All right, next example, -11 plus 18. All right, so we have a -11 plus 18. Okay, the 18 has the larger magnitude and it is positive. So I know my answer is going to be positive. And then I'm going to subtract those absolute values. And again, remember the largest magnitude needs to go first. And that was 18. So it's the absolute value of +18 minus the absolute value of -11. So my answer is going to be positive. Absolute value of 18 is 18 minus absolute value of -11 is 11. So again, that line right there is the one I really need to see. That tells me that you know the rule. So my final answer is positive, which I don't have to write down a positive. My answer is positive. Do not write a positive sign. 18 minus 11 is 7. So there's my answer, +7. All right, one more example. Okay, -4 plus 12. So again, look at both the numbers. They are different signs. Okay, so the 12 has the larger magnitude, so that's the one I'm going to keep. So that's the sign I'm going to keep. Okay, and then I'm going to subtract their absolute values. And again, the 12 has the largest magnitude, so it goes first, minus the absolute value of -4. So positive, absolute value of 12 is 12, minus absolute value of -4 is 4. So my final answer is positive, which you don't have to write down. 12 minus 4 is 8. So again, make sure that you are writing this down line right here, because that is the rule. I need to see that you know the rules. All right, so if you want to try one on your own, press pause and give it a shot. All right, here we go. So different signs, positive sign and negative sign. So this one has the largest magnitude, so I know the answer is going to be negative. And then I'm going to subtract their absolute values. Again, -13 is the larger magnitude, so it goes first, and then +8 is the smaller, it goes second. So negative absolute value of -13 is 13 minus absolute value of 8 is 8. So my final answer is -5. Again, remember, show all your work. Do not just put it in the calculator and press enter. I know the calculator can do it. I really need to see if you know the rules and you know how to do this. So just to recap, here are 2 rules. If you are adding real numbers, if they have the same sign, you add their absolute values and you keep that common sign, whatever it was. If they have different signs, you are going to subtract their absolute values and you are going to keep the sign of the number with the largest absolute value, that larger magnitude. You're going to keep that sign. All right, so here are some examples. So if you want to press pause and give these a try and see how you do. We're going to test your knowledge of fractions as well, so it's going to be interesting. All right, here we go. So a negative plus a positive. So we're going to keep the negative sign because the 21 had the larger magnitude. And then we're going to subtract their absolute values. So I'm going to start with the absolute value of -21, which is 21, and then the absolute value of 12, which is 12. So my final answer is -9. Again, remember I showed the rule here, and then I have my answer. So always think of it that way. Are you showing the rule? Are you simplifying it to get your answer? All right, B, we have a positive plus a negative. The positive has the larger magnitude, so I know this answer is going to be positive. And again, I'm going to subtract their absolute values because they are different signs. So the absolute value of 22 goes first, and then the absolute value of -9 is 9. So my final answer is positive 13. All right, C. C is a trick question. I wanted to see if you're paying attention, okay? Is 0 a signed number? The answer is no. 0 does not have a sign, so I do not have to use the rules. In fact, we talked about 0 before. I can add 0 to anything and it doesn't change it. So 0 plus negative 12, if you have no money and you owe me $12, guess what? You still owe me $12. So no rules necessary on that one. It was kind of a trick question. All right, D, really testing whether you know your fractions. Again, so here section 1.3 with fractions comes back yet again. All right, so we're going to look at those denominators. They are different. So sometimes comparing them is very difficult when they have different denominators. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to rewrite both of these fractions with a common denominator. They're both prime, so I know that I can just multiply these together. 5 times 3 is 15. So there's my LCD of 15. So that means this first one I'm going to have to multiply by 3. So negative 4 times 3 is negative 12. Second one I'm going to have to multiply by 5 to get 15. So 2 times 5 is 10. So now I have both of my fractions with the same denominator. It's much easier to tell which one has the larger magnitude now. All right, so I've got a negative 12 and a positive 10. Negative 12, definitely the larger magnitude. So I know the answer is going to be negative. Okay, they have different signs, so I'm subtracting them. I'm going to subtract their absolute values. So 12 fifteenths minus absolute value of 10 fifteenths is 10 fifteenths. So my final answer is negative. Remember, keep the denominator, subtract the numerators. And I cannot simplify that fraction. So there's my final answer, negative 2 fifteenths. Objective number 3 we're going to need for the next section. So this is just kind of an objective to help get you ready. Finding the opposite. In math, we need to know what opposites are. Opposites mean that they are the same distance from 0 on the number line, but they're in different directions. Okay, one's in the positive direction and one is in the negative direction. Sometimes opposites in math are called additive inverses because if you add them together, if you add up two opposites, they should always add up to 0. So I can just use a basic example like the number 2. What's the opposite of negative of 2? Oh, sorry, I just gave you the answer. That was nice of me. All right, the opposite of 2 is negative 2. And if I add those together, what happens? If you have $2 and you owe me $2, you have nothing. So that's why opposites are sometimes called additive inverses. Okay, so they're just going to ask you some very simple, these are not meant to be difficult. So when you get to these, don't panic. They are supposed to be this easy. Okay, what is the opposite of negative 35? The opposite of a negative is positive, so positive 35. What is the opposite of positive 12? Negative 12. What is the opposite of negative 3/11? Positive 3/11. What is the opposite of positive 1.9? Negative 1.9. Yes, they are supposed to be that simple when you get to this. So when you get to these, don't panic. It's supposed to be easy. All right, so again, anytime you take the opposite of a number, okay, their sum is going to add up. It's going to be 0, right? We already talked about that. And here's another great thing. If you take the opposite of a negative number, what's the opposite of a negative? It's always positive. So if you have two negative signs together, they become a positive, which is really great. And that's a great way for us to save a little bit of time when we have some of these problems. So let me show you how that works. Okay, so our last example for this section. All right, so notice here we have two negatives together. Okay, if you say this correctly, this is the opposite of negative 22. What is the opposite of negative 22? It is positive 22. So notice those two negatives together made a positive. Kind of a great little trick. Okay, so here, same thing. We're going to use that little trick. The opposite of negative 2 is, the opposite of negative 2/7, sorry, is positive 2/7. The opposite of negative x is x. If you have absolute values, though, you need to be careful, because absolute values means we have a little bit of work to do. So first I have to do this. What is the absolute value of negative 14? That is positive 14. So this is the opposite of positive 14. What's the opposite of positive 14? Negative 14. And I actually already have it written down by doing that. E is the same way. Okay, we have the opposite of, what's the absolute value of 2.3. Okay, that is the opposite of 2.3, which is negative 2/3. So just be careful when you have parentheses. Parentheses and absolute values are different. They don't act the same way. So you have to make sure that you're paying attention to when you have parentheses versus when you have absolute values. All right, so that is section 1.5, and we are going to use all of these rules again in section 1.6. So make sure that you don't forget this stuff because you're going to need it for the next section. All right, we'll see you next.